AUDIOACUHO. Hello and welcome to the first, the premiere, the beginning of AUDIOACUHO, the podcast where we connect housing professionals from Ontario, Canada, and maybe someday the world.
I don't know if we can say the world.
Okay, all over Canada, to discuss the topics that are important to the members, by the members, for the members. I'm J Copeland, Residence Life Coordinator, Humber College.
And I'm Ryan Doherty, Residence Life Facilitator at Ryerson University.
And we will be your OACU hosts for the show. Today we'll be speaking with William Logan, Residence Life Coordinator from Concordia University of Edmonton in Alberta on the topic of transition. What sort of transition, you ask? We've got something for everyone. We're talking student to professional staff, moving from a college to university or vice versa, and transitioning from one province to another.
William recently wrote an article for The Pulse, which we encourage you to check out, and inspired us to invite him to have a discussion around today. So, William, perhaps you can start us off with why you believe the subject of transition is so important. What really inspired the article?
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me here. I wanted to take 1 second to acknowledge that on my end, I'm recording this podcast on the traditional territory of the Treaty 6 Nations and the homeland of the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 4. I'm excited to be here to talk about transitions. I think it's an important topic, and what spurred me on to start writing about this is that we talk a lot about the transitions that our students go through, which is a good thing. We should be talking about that. But I see a real need in our field to talk a lot more about what we go through when we transition. And like it was said, all different kinds of transitions. I think that there's this idea that transitions are meant for HR staff to sort of manage, but we have a real role and a real knowledge about this that we can be applying to staff as well. And so I wanted to pull together a bunch of information about that as I recently transitioned to Alberta to start my first professional role and was doing a lot of reflection on it.
Yeah. I think, transition is a topic that kind of, it's on everyone's mind, right? I know I spent many years as a student staff member in a number of different institutions around the country, Fleming, Waterloo, Humber. And one of the largest things at the top of my mind was I've had this great student experience. And now how do I move on to become the next level? How do I become the leader in this role that has guided me in my progression as a student staff? And that, can be very challenging and daunting because, we're in highly sought after positions. Yeah. And I was wondering if either of the two of you had any experience with that we might be able to speak to today.
Yeah, I can say something. Yeah. So I think, it's interesting because no one sort of, I don't think, grows up dreaming about becoming a residence life professional.
And it's not really up there with firefighter or police officer, I don't think.
Astronaut, maybe, movie star.
Astronaut, that was the best one.
And so, sometimes people will grow up and I remember when I was, 3 or 4 years old, I would line my stuffed animals up and teach them what I learned in school that day. And I had this dream of becoming a teacher. And then when I was a student in residence, I was like, whoa, hold on. This is super cool. This is education. This is mental health. This is behavior. This is everything that I'm interested in. And so, I think that there's a piece to that of this isn't something that's super mainstream in maybe literature or media. And so there's not as much out there. We're not thinking about growing up into this our whole life and taking courses on it in high school.
Well, that's it, is a number of people don't, you're not in school for residence life or student development kind of thing. You're usually participating in a different program that's aimed at getting you a different job or career, but you end up working in this position that many people stick with. And, some few people are like, oh, I actually want to pursue that. And I think, that's a question a lot of people might have in the membership side of things is how do I transition from this student role into a more professional one? And I know that some institutions are paraprofessionals are part of the staff mix, but others are smaller. And I know that you're in a bit of a smaller institution yourself, and I'm not sure what that looks like on your end, William, but for us, transition can be difficult. Yeah.
Now, Jay, I think you're speaking to this idea of mentorship and how mentorship can help with that transition, right? So
yeah.
earlier, William, you were talking about I wanted to be a teacher, and then there was a moment where something happened, and you were like, you know what, I can do the things that I want to do in this field of student housing and student affairs,
Mhm.
and it was an eye opening opportunity. And so somewhere along the way, you either had mentorship, you had a supportive supervisor who told you, hey, maybe this is something you should consider. And I think that that mentorship is really key. But as an association, it's really important for us to think about who are those folks that we're shoulder tapping. I know, or I'm sure that both of you have seen the OACUHO Ethnic Diversity Report and the work that was being done there.
Mhm.
And when we think about supporting our student leaders to transition into the field, we do need to think about who are we shoulder tapping, why are we shoulder tapping them, and what they can actually contribute to the field, right? And
Mhm.
it's I think it's something important for us to think about.
I think that's a good point. Is like on both sides of the conversation is like for students, if you're a student staff member and you're looking into like pursuing this, like, you know, raise your hand. There's a ton of people vying for positions in student life and like residence life and student development. And if this is something that actually interests you, like let the people know. We're all leaders. We've all been in your shoes. And if you let us know that this is something you're interested in doing, then I think it transitions to like the professional role. Okay, how do I give this person opportunities to engage in like important learning that's going to ease them into, the role, or at least helping them answer like the questions that come up during like the job interviews and things, so that they can start critically thinking about how, residents or student, development, whatever, is managed from like a higher up level when they're still in those sort of student shoes. So considering
Mhm.
what the next steps are, even though they don't have to take them.
Right. Now, I guess one of the things that I think would be interesting to ask the two of you, and I know, William, you asked some folks that you interviewed, what were some of the biggest lessons that came in from learning and stepping into a new role?
Mhm.
For myself, the thing that I learned and the biggest transition was that the professional life is not all programming and floor meetings and hanging
No.
out with students. That was something that I inherently knew, but I didn't feel it until I was doing a lot more of the challenging work, the thinking of curriculum, the
Mhm.
uh, high level conduct cases where we're talking about possible evictions and things like that. That I knew was part of my job, but I wasn't emotionally ready for that.
Hmm.
Mhm.
A piece of advice maybe that I would want to give to students who are listening is if, because something that I found really interesting in becoming a professional staff is I've made decisions over the past year that I know me as a student staff would have disagreed with completely or not understood. And so, I would encourage supervisors to talk to their student staff openly about what their concerns are and share what they can within privacy laws, because sometimes there is, like what you're talking about, that bigger picture thinking, and those huge decisions are tough on you, and they're also tough on your staff, and it benefits both to have open, honest conversations about that.
Mhm. I think one of the things that you sort of wrote about in your article as well, William, was the feeling of imposter syndrome and having
Mhm.
to make sure that you weren't convincing yourself you were less competent than you truly were. Because I remember coming into the position myself, and I struggled, quite honestly, getting into the position because I didn't have a paraprofessional role, and it was difficult getting that like sort of in between level experience, coming from a smaller institution at the time. And when I finally did manage to get my first role, it wasn't a bit of like the transition sphere, because it was offered to me in British Columbia, and
Mm.
I was still a student at the time and chose to depart university in favor of taking up this role that I'd worked so hard to get. And my transition to out there was different, because I wasn't surrounded by this huge network of like support and like colleagues. I was very much in like an isolated area working with somebody else who'd been working in the field for a while, and I was like, oh my god, like do I actually know what I'm doing? Like I have a lot of great ideas and like things that I feel are very important to me, but at the same time I don't know that I'm necessarily in alignment with those other things. And I think that relates back to what you were saying of like making decisions that you wouldn't normally have agreed with as a student staff.
Yeah, well, and I think the thing with with imposter syndrome is that it's sort of our reptilian brains, it's that fight or flight. It's when you get that call in the middle of the night and you know how to handle it, but your first instinct is maybe I should call the manager on call just to check.
Yeah.
And then you take that deep breath and you're like, no, hold on, I know what I'm doing here. But also that speaks to you want to have a manager that you can call if you need to for something that you don't know or just something you need to touch base on. And so for folks who are transitioning maybe to a whole new province where you're leaving behind your family and your friend support systems, I would encourage you in interviews to ask questions about culture and about management style, because you're going to rely on that a little bit more than you might have when you have, especially in that first month or so when you're used to having your friends maybe in the room next to you.
Yeah, I think that's actually like very important, is just, the ability to have those conversations and say to your manager, like, hey, like, is it okay if I call if I'm unsure? Because,
Mm.
that's, especially transitioning into a new institution where, many of us, if we're getting into different roles, are going to be at a new institution that has different values than you're used to, or like things that are specific to it.
Now, when we talk about this imposter syndrome that both of you have mentioned, I think it's something worth mentioning that people have different coping mechanisms for the imposter syndrome. So I think about myself when I entered that first role, uh, and my imposter syndrome made me super insecure and wanting to present that I knew everything, that I was highly
Mhm.
trained and ready to go, which also I think inhibited the way in which I bonded and connected with people because I was so conscious of presenting this highly competent person that I
Yeah.
wasn't even giving myself the space to stumble or pretend, or sorry, not even pretend, to make those mistakes where I was trying to convince people that I already knew the answers. And that was something that I had a colleague have a conversation with me of like, it's okay if you don't know the answers. And so
We learn from
my
making mistakes.
coping for the imposter syndrome was to present an overconfident, and it really inhibited my ability to learn in that first year or so.
Yeah. I think that's like you're always told to like fake it till you make it, right? And like you were
Mm,
very much like living that up. And I don't think like faking it until you make it is like great to get your like foot in the door, but like beyond that, you need to start having like communication is critical on any team. You need to talk to your staff and you need to talk to your managers regardless of what position you're in, to have that communication to say like, "Hey, I'm transitioning here. I'm new to this role and I'm interested in going places with it. Like, what can I learn from your experience? Like, teach me, mentor me, like let me be your student sensei."
mhm.
Yeah, and it's interesting too because we say a lot to. I know I say a lot to my staff when they come to me with, whatever sort of concerns are going on in their personal life. A question I often pose to them is what would you tell a student who came to you with this concern?
Mhm.
And it's really hard to give ourselves the advice that we would give to other people. But what we say to our student staff is if you don't know what's going on or you have questions, please come and ask me. But then we're really scared to do that ourselves. And getting over that fear is tough, but it's crucial.
Yeah. And we've talked a little bit now about sort of like the transitions that we've had from one province to another. I know, William, you and I have both transitioned from province to province. I initially came from Ontario and went to BC as my first professional role. And then now I've transitioned from BC back to Ontario in a professional role. Do we want to talk about some of the differences we've experienced in those like transition times?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So what was your experience? If you'll remind me as to how your transition kind of went.
Totally. So my transition, I was taking full-time studies at Trent University, and then I was taking full-time studies at Fleming College.
Mhm.
And what I've learned about myself is that I am an awful full-time student.
You and me
um,
both.
yeah, it's tough, and I think it's tough for everyone. But I really struggled with it, but I loved this residence life thing. I'll be honest with you, it's what kept me in post secondary. It got to a point where I was doing post secondary so I could do residence life.
Yeah.
And that's not the overall goal, I don't think. I think you want to have that balance. And so I embarked on this sort of scary journey of trying to find a professional staff position so I could do residence life full time and finish my bachelor's online without a
Mhm.
bachelor's degree.
Yeah.
Um, And so I've been really transparent about the reason why I came to Concordia and moved across the country was because they were the only place that offered me a job. Um,
Hmm.
I have no problem saying that. And so it felt like I had no other choice, and it was so freaking terrifying. I'll tell you that.
Yeah.
Um, but I'm so glad that it worked out the way it did. And there's little things, and we can talk about the little things that change from province to province that you have to be mindful of. But the
Yeah.
heart of the work stays the same, and that's what's driving me.
That's one of the things that like I wish like I don't understand the requirements of like most positions to be like, you must have a degree. And like I assume that's like you've lived the full life of a student at that point.
Mhm.
But for the most part, it's experience. And like have you worked in the position before? Do you understand interacting with other people? Are you good at like there's so many skills that I need to employ in my regular, working day that I did not learn in any way in my degree. That it's like, why is this a requirement? Because nobody, as we mentioned at the start, like nobody's going to school for like, I want my degree in residence life so I can become a residence life coordinator. Like that tends to happen when you get into like a master's of something and start looking at those even higher up positions. But at the start of things, it can be daunting to like, because I know I started off at a college, and it was when Humber College started offering I was in like the first cohort of Humber College offering their like applied applied degrees, which was like a college now offering like degree level programs. And that's sort of viewed as like, a questionable thing at times. I feel like now it's become more common. But when I first graduated, I was like, oh my God, like people are like, oh, he's from a college. We're a university. It's
Mm.
his college level education will never relate to our experience here, which I found challenging, to be honest with you. And like, I'm glad to see that we've incorporated paraprofessional roles and things for, in many institutions so that student staff can get that experience that, allows them to like get through the interview stage and show that they have skills in being able to accomplish the work that we do.
I think, yeah, one of the things that I wanted to ask the two of you, knowing you've both worked across the country, really, is sort of your own personal transition. Within the association, a lot of times people will move for a job. And William, you talked about moving for a job because Concordia is who hired you, but that
Mhm.
brought you to a place in Alberta where I'm assuming you had no network. You might have connected with the people who hired you, and that's it, right? So how do we have these conversations preparing folks for these massive transitions of their life outside of work as well? Because what we know, even because we love a good student development theory, uh, and what we know about the way students develop and work through transition is that their network and their support around them is so important to facilitating an effective transition, right?
Yeah.
How did the two of you build that build that network in a new city repeatedly?
Ooh, Will, you want to take this first, or do you want me to take a stab at
I can say my answer is easy, and the answer is I didn't do those things, Ryan.
it? Honest,
Um,
honestly, like agreed. So you take it away.
yeah, yeah. Well, and I'm so glad. That's why I'm so glad we're talking about it because I didn't do those things. I had been to Edmonton once before in my life, before I moved here. It's kind of a funny story. I flew out here to interview for another institution in Edmonton, and then wasn't hired there, but then ended up being hired here, which was funny because I was like, "That's so great! I was just there." Um, but that was my only orientation to Edmonton. So I knew the people at the airport who scanned my bags, and I knew my supervisor. And I was caught up in, again, a little bit of that imposter syndrome where all I was worried about was doing a fantastic job in my role, that everything else sort of got put to the side. And we talk a lot, again, to our students about how living and working at the same place means you have to make time for yourself. And it's such an easy trap to fall into because as a professional staff, I didn't. Now I do. Obviously, for all of us, coronavirus has made some of that challenging. Um,
Wow.
yeah, yeah. But
Yeah.
making personal friendships with my colleagues and just getting involved in the local community. I volunteer with a couple local organizations. Um, and even professionally going to visit other institutions in the city and just making those connections there. Finding those things is just so life sustaining and
Yeah.
makes me better at my job.
I can't agree with you more on that. I moved out west to Thompson Rivers University, which is in Kamloops, British Columbia. Look it up if you don't know where that is. It's about 3 hours from the next city in
Mm,
any direction. It is not necessarily a small town, but it's very spread out, and there's a definite like age gap in the 20 to 35 area of people, where like people just aren't, unless you're at the university, which is a smaller university. As a student, there's basically no one there because people have either gotten married or whatever. So, one of the things that I was initially confronted by was this like complete lack of like a social support. And like,
mm,
thankfully, we had multiple residence life staff there. My friend Andrew Macarith out there became like a really good friend of mine because we would basically spend just a lot of time together during the week. But even then, you want to be able to give your coworkers a break and things. So one of the things, and as you said, William, was for me making that transition successful, because initially it was very hard. And I mentioned outside of the podcast that I had built a fantastic gaming computer to keep in touch with my Ontario friends, to have a little bit of social support and social life. Um, but the time difference makes that challenging. It was like I ended up volunteering with like the city and doing stuff for tourism, and I joined like a local kind of like sports team for dragon boating. And it's those things where you have to kind of reach outside of your institution and like become connected with like the greater community, that in some of those like smaller places you might need to support yourself with. Like, you essentially do have to like build your social circle up again from like scratch, which is I think the biggest challenge, because the job was one thing, but you have supports there for that by and large. Or you can potentially reach out to some previous colleagues that you might have for some assistance. But transitioning to the actual new physical space when you're moving province to province, I found was actually a greater challenge for me.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree. I think really some of the things I would recommend is, if you're faith based, finding a church or whatever that faith group is in the new area, so that you start having those community groups and that network there. If you play sports, if you're fortunate enough to be in a larger city, that means there might be adult sports leagues or open gyms. If you sing in a choir, love theater, whatever that is, finding where those spaces are. And I think, Jay, you talked about leaning on some of your colleagues to help
Mhm.
make friendships as well, whether they are in the new city or if they just know someone and can set you up on a friend date. Right?
Yeah.
I'm visioning for our post-COVID world where we can go for coffee with a random stranger again,
That'd be nice.
and I'm hopeful. I'm very hopeful. But I think it is something that is important. And once again, when we talk about students, often with transition, I'm meeting with students and I'm empathizing with the fact that making friends is really hard. And we assume it's just this super easy thing because maybe it was easy in high school, or
It
you're
just gets harder.
making friends is very hard. Making
Yeah.
friends as an adult is even harder.
Mhm.
And so there is a lot of work that needs to go into it. But I also think that helps. It helps you bring a much better version of yourself to work, and you can do a better job when you feel whole and well.
Yes, you have to take care of you before you can take care of other people. Because if you're not operating at 100%, you can't give other people your 100%, which is good to take away, Brandon. So quickly, just being mindful of the time here, I know we wanted to touch a little bit on college to university transition. So, William, I'm just going to toss it over to you to let us know and the listeners what your experiences are with that and what you kind of wanted to talk about.
Yeah, so for me, I wrote this article really with the intention of trying to focus on reflection. And so there's no, academic studies cited in my article. I don't even define the word transition, and that was really intentional because I think I really wanted us to be able to read an article or have a conversation like this and focus on ourselves and our experience. And nowhere is that more sort of poignant than in university to college, because I think that there can be a lot of assumptions about the difference between a university environment and a college environment.
Yeah.
When I transitioned to a college, I was convinced that the students would be have a lot of behavior challenges. There'd be a high level of conduct and a low level of academic engagement. I was convinced that that would be the case.
Yeah.
Totally not the case. But that's just sort of one of those biases that I had to have checked. And so I don't know, and feel free to jump in if there is literature out there, or there is sort of standards, but I don't know that there is one sort of set blueprint for college to university besides remember the heart of the work and keep your mind open.
I think our titles sum it up best for me in that, like, sometimes you've got residence life coordinators, sometimes, like our wonderful friend Ryan here, you've got residence life facilitators, which is a fun new one for me. Sometimes you've got residence managers, residence life managers, residence coordinator, things like that, just within this position alone. And it's not necessarily college to university. It's like institution to institution. There's going to be differences in titling and just the structure and the general way that they do things. And I like to think that, well, I don't like to think that, I feel that most places are like, oh, we have this tradition or this structure where, like, we run this and it works kind of the best. And they kind of look outward, but they very much have like their own practices set in place that have developed as they have over the various decades and years that they have existed for. So I think a thing to keep in mind as a person transitioning from anywhere to anywhere, and something that I like to give people as like a new professional standpoint, is take a semester to sit back and like observe the processes that are happening within your like new institution, and don't necessarily like be like, okay, I'm coming with all these great ideas, so I'm going to start making changes right away. Like, one thing I would say is like sit back, observe how things work, see where you can like learn from things, and then after that like semester of like understanding how the machine functions, then try and tweak it and make like efficiency improvements.
Absolutely. I had a friend when I was down in Oklahoma working and doing my master's there. We used to give him a hard time. His catchphrase was "at my previous institution," and then he
Yeah.
would finish the sentence.
Yeah.
And I do think that, Jay, you just spoke to this idea that whether it's universities or colleges, there's big institutions, small institutions. I was an undergrad at Laurier and a student staff there, where we had, oh goodness, probably 120 student staff members.
Yeah.
Any Laurier folks listening, you don't need to check my number there, but it felt like a
Oh,
lot.
Lord.
And then I come to Ryerson, where my first year we had 30 student staff.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the differences there are so great. They're both universities, but the context is so different. And trying to map exactly what you do at an institution like Laurier with a massive program onto a small team where there were only 2 residence life facilitators, which is your live-in residence life professional role,
Yeah.
it didn't work. So you have to find what works in that context.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, unless there was anything you wanted to add to the end of that there, William, we're coming up to the end of our time. So was there anything you wanted to tack on there, or we gonna wrap this thing up?
In one sentence, I want to, well, be more than one sentence, but just wanted to say that that again really speaks to our imposter syndrome conversation, because I am totally suffering from at my previous institution syndrome. It's
It
hopefully
happens
not
to
as
all
much
of us.
anymore. Yeah, right. It's just such a tool that we have in our back pocket to make us feel knowledgeable. And so I just want to put a call out to all my fellow at my previous institutioners. It's such a great point. It's
Yeah.
so hard. It's so hard, but use it for what it's worth, and only for what it's worth.
I think that's a healthy way to wrap this up. To everyone at our previous institutions, thank you for listening. For anyone else who we haven't yet had the pleasure of working with, again, thank you for joining us on this preliminary podcast. And that's all the time that we have for today. So thank you, William, for joining us.
Thank you.
Yes, and if you want to continue the conversation on this topic, feel free to contact William at william.logan@concordia.ab.ca, or you can get a hold of myself, Ryan, at ryan.doherty@ryerson.ca, or jason.copeland@humber.ca. If you're interested in participating in the podcast, totally reach out to us. We'd be excited to have you on.
And we're looking forward to having you all tune in for the next episode of AUDIOACUHO.